The first of our two men to be born was Charles Smith, Albert Charles Smith. Born in April of 1869 in Wandsworth. He was the son of a gardener in the days where there were still stately homes to be found in that particular part of London. His father rose to become head gardener and his mother a housekeeper at one of those big houses. He grew up in a family of a large family of 13 children. One of his brothers was called Cupid, interestingly enough. Now he grew up to become, unlike his father, he became a bootmaker. And he was the last of his family to leave home. He stayed at home until he was about 22 years old. And then he came to work up at Banstead Asylum as an assistant in the shoemaker's shop. Now, the asylum had something like 2,000 patients. They all needed clothes and they all needed shoes. And so a shoemaker, 2 assistants, and 7 or 8 patients, helping them out as perhaps a form of therapy as much as anything else, toiled all day long in the shoemaker shop. And I don't know, they might even have been making shoes for sale, perhaps. After working there for about 5 years in that role, he was promoted. He became the asylum's chief shoemaker and bootmaker. Now, he got married to a Norfolk girl, Annie Ducker, and she had family around here as well. I think one of her sisters was working in service around here, and when the sister got married, it was here at All Saints, and Charles was one of the witnesses that signed the register that day. Now, they had 3 children together. They had a home near Sutton Hospital. There are 3 old cottages. One of them is a white weatherboard cottage, which is quite distinctive by the entrance to Sutton Hospital, on what's now called Cotswold Road. So if you're driving from Banstead and you're passing Sutton Hospital and the Marsden on your right, and you come down to the junction with the main road into Sutton. So with the allotments on your left, there's a white weatherboard cottage on your right. 2 houses down from that is where Charles and his family lived, in a semi-detached cottage. Charles and Annie Smith at number 5, and their neighbours, Charles and Annie Smith at number 6, rather confusingly. Now, at the time, that was called Banstead Road, which threw me for a while. I thought he must be a Carshalton man, because that's where Banstead Road is, but I found out yesterday he's Belmont. So there we go. He's not named on the Belmont War Memorial, and we've notified their branch of the British Legion in order to get that corrected. Now, he worked there at the asylum for a number of years, and he was still working there when war broke out. Now, all of the men were encouraged to join up. The council would continue to pay their wages to their dependents, and they keep their jobs open for them until they got back. Now, Charles was probably an ex-military man. I haven't found his service records. He has, unfortunately, a very common name, so it's very difficult to track him down. But he either served full-time in the army or as what they called a special reservist. So he would have had 6 months full-time training and then been a reservist after that, like a territorial soldier to some extent. And he was a member of the National Reserve. This was one of the many reserve organisations we had, mostly with old men. You had to be an ex-soldier or an ex-special reservist to be a member, and they were usually too old to fight. We're talking about men in their 40s, even their 50s. In fact, there was no upper age limit at all. And these men all signed a pledge that they would help their country in her hour of need. And so this reserve was called up in the autumn of 1914, and they were embodied for service in November. And at that point, Charles left the asylum. His wife started to draw his wages, and he went off with the East Surrey Regiment, one of our local regiments. Now, he was in the 5th Battalion, which are territorials. All the young territorials, or most of the young territorials, had volunteered to go overseas and had already left. And what was left behind were the family men who had ties that bound them to home and they couldn't simply go off to war, and the old men, like Charles, men in their 40s. Many of the asylum men were ex-military men, and he would have known many of the fathers of a lot of the men that we've commemorated, who were sons of the asylum men. And they were formed into sort of an equivalent of the Home Guard, protection companies, and they were posted to guard railway bridges, gasworks, electricity substations, all those sort of vital points. A job they did for a couple of years until we realised there was no imminent invasion threat. Now, Charles had only been embodied for about a fortnight with them, so he'd been away from his wife and his family, even though he was probably still in the local area, when he fell ill with a skin infection, cellulitis, one of those trivial diseases that would be very easy to remedy these days, a simple dose of antibiotics. Unfortunately, a cut or perhaps a graze on his skin, the cellulitis got into his bloodstream and he developed toxemia, blood poisoning. He was admitted to Croydon Hospital and died there a few days later. And he's, as I said, buried at Sutton Cemetery. He's entitled to a war grave. He doesn't have one, though. And we've taken up that case with the In From the Cold project. They're a group of researchers who identify these men that have been forgotten, who have been missed, and take up their case with the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. So I hope that before the year is out, that he will have an officially recognised war grave. The second of our asylum men we're commemorating today, on the 103rd anniversary of his death, is Albert Seal. He was born in April of 1887. He was the son of a greengrocer. They used to live at the bottom of Sutton, down in Collingwood Road. He came here when he was very young, 2 or 3 years old. He'd been born in Mitcham and baptised at the church there. Again, he came from another big family. He's one of at least 7 children in that family. Now, he is a bit of a tearaway. He's a bit of a troublemaker, I'm afraid. Now, every generation of parents believes that their children are going to the dogs. And, you see it at Shakespeare's time, these gangs of young blades with their swords and all these moral panics, and in the 60s with the mods and the rockers. What is the world coming to? And in Albert's day, it was stone throwing. These gangs of stone throwing youths that were thought to be ruining Sutton, dragging the whole place down. And unfortunately, Albert was one of these. And they used to pass their time. They all had part-time jobs, and Albert was an errand boy. They'd all finished school at 13, so they're all quite young and quite youthful. And they'd spend their time throwing stones at trees and things like that. And then when a passing dignitary came by, they'd start throwing stones at them instead if it wasn't the policeman. But of course, in those days, there was a policeman on every street every 5 minutes or so. And so these boys were forever getting caught or chased around by the policeman. And Albert was one of 2 boys from a big gang of kids that were caught. And he was had up before the magistrates and fined 2 shillings and 6pence, which for an adult wouldn't be too bad, but for a child, that's an awful lot of money, I should imagine. And they were told in no uncertain terms that if they should do it again, they'd be in some serious trouble. But luckily, he seems to have cleaned up his act and kept with better company after that, because that's his first and only brush with the law. Now, he became a labourer. He outgrew his errand boy's job, and he outgrew being a labourer as well. He joined the army in 1906. He signed on with the Scots Guards for 3 years with the colours, so that's 3 years full-time service, and then 9 years as a reservist. Now, he completed his education when he was with the army, got a third-class certificate of education, which had brought him up to a pretty good standard. It would given him the ability to be promoted up as high as a corporal. A lot of the army men had very little education, very little schooling, and so it was a good way of bettering yourself, of advancing yourself. So he got his certificate of education. He piled on the pounds through good, solid army food and gymnastic courses. He put on about 1 stone in his first 6 months in the army. He was still growing, he was still young, he was only 18, so he'd grown about ½ an inch in his first 6 months there as well. And we have his service records. We've lost most of our service records from the First World War, but the Guards Regiment have all theirs separately, and so we're able to tell a bit about him. He was 5'9¼ tall, grey eyes, brown hair, fresh complexion, tattoo of a heart and dagger on his left forearm, very dramatic. And he served with them, he trained with them for a number of time, all on the home front. When he came to the end of his 3 years, he signed on, not just for the minimum that he could do as a reserve, but he signed on to an extra commitment, a Class A reserve. So that means he got more pay, so he got another 7 shillings a week. But it did mean that he could be called away at any time should there be any kind of overseas emergency. Like many ex-military men, he joined the asylum as an attendant, as effectively a male nurse. And he worked there until the time that the war broke out. He met a girl, Harriett Birch, and they got married. She seems to have been working in service. Now, there are all the witnesses on the marriage register are from his side of the family, and I've got a theory that they were keeping the marriage secret from her side, because it seems that they actually lived apart for some time, for 2 years after their marriage, until she fell pregnant with a daughter who was born, and it's only at that point that they moved in together. And they took a house together in Sutton. Albert had been living at the asylum in on-site accommodation, and then moved into a terraced house 8 Beulah Road. It's still there today at the bottom of Sutton. And their neighbours at number 9 were the Stalwarts, and unfortunately we'll be meeting Thomas Stalwart at the end of the year, another asylum man. Albert was called up as a reservist. He was called up as soon as war was declared. He rejoined the Scots Guards, the 2nd Battalion, initially at the Tower of London. They provided garrisons for guard, patrols, picket patrols for guard duty in London, guarding the ports of London, vulnerable points. And then they trained down in the New Forest for a month or so, while a new division, the 7th Division, was trained and formed, ready to go and join the fight in France. And they did that in October of 1914. When they arrived in Belgium, everything was chaos. It was still very much a war of movement, armies on the move all the time, like two boxers sort of shadow boxing, as it were. And so they arrived, and they were sent here, there and everywhere to cover the withdrawal of troops from the besieged city of Antwerp, then off back to the coast, to cover the arrival of a cavalry division, and then off somewhere else to plug a gap in case the Germans came through. And they never quite meet the Germans at this point. All they find really are rumours, and occasionally they sight distant patrols. And just as the Germans reach them, they're pulled back once more. And this pattern repeats itself. And they are pulled back further and further into Belgium, with the Germans apparently on their toes. And they start to get overflown by German aircraft, and the war starts to become much more of a reality for them. So at this point, the British Army's been in France for nearly 3 months. And they are, an reorganisation takes place. The British are moved up onto the northern flank of the French army, onto the left, much nearer the Channel coast. And they're sent to the market town of Ypres, this low-lying medieval town surrounded by hills, which the Germans had briefly been in, decided they weren't going to stay there. And the British, the French and the Belgians moved in their stead. And it's there that the British and the French and Belgians form a defensive line, and that's where the German blow strikes. 2 army groups that come and attack in late October and begin the First Battle of Ypres, the first, or the end that marks the end of the War of Movement. This is the very last battle, the last opportunity that both sides had really of breaking a deadlock before it had even begun, as it were. It's chaos. Albert wrote home and he described it as hell upon earth. That's a phrase that we see time and time again from those first men. Those 2 years later, I suppose everyone's conditioned to the reality, but those men that fight in 14 and 15, it's described as a literal hell in some cases. So Albert has a very bad experience. During that time, the Scots Guards as a whole have a very bad experience. They're forever on the move from one place to another. You know, there's always a new threat somewhere. There's always a gap to be filled. And every time they're sent off, you know, day to day with no rest in between, hardly any sleep, with these makeshift scrapes of trenches under German shell fire most of the time. Every time they're sent somewhere, they lose men. You know, they're sent chasing phantom reports of Germans. They lose 50 men for no reason. You know, they're sent cross-country, advancing through barrages. It's a terrible attritional warfare. There are no reinforcements coming. So these tired men are getting more and more tired. They've got more and more to do. They've got more yards of a trench to dig because there's not anybody else next to them to dig it anymore. They fight in 2 major engagements when they lose serious amounts of men, once at the village of Crucica, and then later on somewhere else. The worst part of that is that having survived the actual fight with the Germans with minimal casualties, as they retire back to the British lines, they're mistaken for Germans by the troops in the British lines, who then open fire on them, causing very bad casualties. After about 3 weeks of the battle, they're withdrawn, very much depleted in numbers, and they're sent south to the Franco-Belgian border, the River Lys. It's a very flat, low-lying ground, crisscrossed with irrigation ditches all over the place. The trenches must have been full of standing water most of the time. This time of the war, very, very crude trenches, no wire in front of them. Very few of them had any kind of parapet in front or parados behind. There were no traversing, no wiggly-woggling of the trenches. They're all straight lines. Sometimes they're not even joined up all the way. Very primitive conditions, very few dugouts, nowhere that's particularly safe. And it's into this is their first experience of proper trench warfare when they arrive there. It's a time when new weapons and new tactics are arriving all the time, and more guns are arriving all the time as well. And it becomes an increasingly dangerous, and increasingly unhealthy place to be throughout the autumn of 1914. It was nearly Christmas when they launched what was one of the first attacks from a static trench line. The Scots Guards were sending over just 2 of their companies, so the 2 companies that were going to attack were given a boost up by the other 2 companies who bodily lifted them up and over the front of their trench into no man's land just before the attack began. On their left were the 2nd Border Regiment. It was a nighttime attack, an evening attack, and they were going to advance about 400 yards to these German trenches in front of them. Now, we have reports that have survived. We don't know if Albert was amongst the attackers or amongst the men behind them. The officer in charge of his men, who were attacking on about a 400-yard front, was in the middle, and his signal to his men to advance was to blow his whistle. Now, you can imagine, in ideal conditions, it's probably difficult. If you're 200 yards away on the other side, it's probably difficult to hear that whistle. But with the guns going, of course, that signal was lost. And so just the troops in the centre start their advance, and the others sort of hang back until they realise there's no other troops on their right or their left anymore, and then they start their advance. The idea is that they advance at a steady pace until they get as close as they can to the German line, and when the Germans spot them, then they're going to rush them at the end. Now, this they do, and of course those front troops, they get in, but those stragglers get caught in the German fire. There's no wire on the German trenches, so they're able to get in. They fight, capture these sections of trench at the point of a bayonet. And the officer in charge has no idea what is going on. No runners sent back have come back to him with any news. So he gets out of his trench to have a look around, and he finds that actually all he's holding is a 25-yard section of trench, and there are no Scots Guards either side of him in the trenches, just dead bodies scattered behind him on no man's land. And he returns to the British line for instructions on what to do. By the time he returns with reinforcements, they've left, they've given up. They've been abandoned by their officer, and they gave up their section of trench. It's a disastrous attack for the Scots Guards and for the battalion on the left. But it was a watershed moment, one of the first times the British Army had made this attack. And we did learn an awful lot from that. Unfortunately, the Germans learned more, made their defences more sophisticated, and everyone starts wiring in their trenches, and then we come to the war that we now know so well. As I said, these were very unhealthy trenches. A lot of standing water in there, a miserable time. There was only one real bright spot, and that was Christmas, just a few days later after that attack. And the Scots Guards took part in that famous Christmas truce. German soldiers came over on Christmas Eve and said, if you don't shoot, we won't shoot. And so it was arranged that the following day everyone met up in no man's land. Albert was given a cigar on a postcard by a German officer. A burial service was held, a joint burial service from both sides was held for the men of the attack of just a few days earlier, a rare moment of humanity in that conflict. And the men exchanged stories. Many of the Germans were found to have been living in England. It was a very popular profession for Germans to be a waiter in London, for example. Many of them had girls, wives, still in England, and so they were anxious for news of what was happening back home. It couldn't last. Some people would have, the Germans would have loved it to have lasted, but the British were quite aggressive, wanted to restart hostilities. There was no way we were going to win a war by just staying where we were. And so a few days later, it was all back to the usual routine, unfortunately. In February of 1915, in those unhealthy, waterlogged conditions, Albert picked up an infection, enteric fever. It's a bacterial infection, probably in the water, very similar to typhoid. A lot of men suffered very badly with it. He would have had headaches, fever, all his limbs, his body would have ached, had bad diarrhoea for a few days. And he was evacuated for treatment to a casualty clearing station, and eventually to a hospital on the French coast at Boulogne. After 6 weeks there, he was shipped home on 1st of April. And after a brief stay in a hospital in London, he was sent home. He wasn't sent home because he was better, he was sent home to die. He was suffering again with enteric fever. He relapsed. And surrounded by his family, he endured, in the words of his widow, terrible suffering. He developed pleurisy, pneumonia, his nervous system started breaking down, and a few days later, 8:30 p.m. today, 103 years ago, he passed away. His funeral cortege was said to be a most impressive sight. He was borne from his home to his grave in Sutton Cemetery in a coffin, draped in the Union Jack, topped with reeds, drawn on a gun carriage. The Scots Guards pipers played a march as they went. After a service at the chapel in Sutton Cemetery, a firing party led by fifes and drums, followed by pipers, fired 3 volleys in salute at his grave. He left a widow and a daughter. He was 28 years old.
Let us pray. Lord, we continue to give you thanks for the opportunity that we are given to remember the servicemen of Banstead, their experience of life in this area and their experiences of war. We thank you for the research which has so assiduously been carried out and has revealed the names of those who were earlier forgotten. And the names sound once more and their memories are revived. We think of the different experiences which these men of the Banstead area saw and participated in, for the older men who desired to serve and to do their best for their country, and for those who were wayward but redeemed themselves through their courage. Lord, once again we are brought to experience ourselves the horrors of war at this time of great difficulty for the men overseas. And we think of that moment when, transcending the battle, the men stepped out and met each other and offered each other a friendly greeting. On that day, when there was peace on earth, where hell on earth had been before and would be again. Lord, we pray that in our remembering, we play a small part in determination that such things should not happen again. We honour the memories of Charles Smith and of Albert Seal this day. We conclude with the blessing. God grant to the living grace, to the departed rest, to the Church, the Queen, the Commonwealth and all people, unity, peace and concord, and to us and all God's servants, life everlasting. And the blessing of God Almighty, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit be with you all, and remain with you always. Amen.
When you go home, tell them of us and say, "Today, tomorrow, we gave our today."